Thank you, Charlie, and thanks to John Yardley. We have to correct a few points here, and that is that a small correction. Charlie said that we live in Connecticut. That's just our address of convenience. We're in the witness protection program, and the address in Connecticut is simply where we receive our mail. We do live in Key West in the winter, and in London in the summer, and then in Rome in the fall. And it's true that we've never owned a place, and we always rent. And we're at an age where we decided we're going to skip that stage of investing in property and just move right into assisted living as soon as they'll have us, and which at the rate we're going won't be long. But I'm glad that you've all come, and it's I'm reminded, I see Chris Dickey over here. I remember his father coming to the University of Virginia 100 years ago and having a crowd that I think filled the football stadium, and his first remark was, what a paltry crowd had shown up to hear him speak, but I'm very flattered that I have it this size. Unfortunately, there are no books, and what I was going to do is read a bit of this book to you, but since all of these stories have been recycled at endless dinner parties over the decades, they're fresh in my mind, and so I'll start by saying that I met little Gore in 1975 when I was 32 and he had just turned 50. And Linda and I had come there to spend a year at the American Academy, and we had an infant son. And he was extremely gracious, generous, and hospitable. And now that's not his reputation, and most people don't see him in that guise, but he was a very hospitable person. I don't think if I, showed up in London and had called Kingsley Amos that he would have invited me over right away for drinks or dinner or something, or if I had shown up in Brooklyn and said to Norman Mailer, I'm here, what's your address? But Gore was, as I said, quite generous, quite receptive, and because Rome was a small city with an even smaller, foreign community, we got to know each other and see each other quite often. My impulse in writing this book, or the motive, other than just greed, was the thought that there was so much written about Gore during his life that didn't really jive with my perception of him. In fact, he made it a point of, I think, offending anybody who tried to form a good impression of him. He was constantly undercutting himself in order to maintain an image that he had, and that image was of a Mandarin patrician character, cold, withdrawn. I remember I can't quote him exactly, but he said that I'm just as I appear down underneath this icy exterior. There's once you break through the ice, you reach ice water. And I don't think that was really the way he was, but I think it's the way he liked to portray himself. He could be, and he was frequently prickly, but this kind of Mandarin image that he liked to project, this notion that he was Marcus Aurelius, that he was Montaigne or something, a man sitting above it all and writing with a kind of remoteness, was not at all the person that I knew. The person I knew was quite different. And I think what you have to remember about Gore is not only was he a screenwriter, but he was in his way an actor. I mean, after all, late in his career, he appeared in several movies. He had appeared in plays before. He was a frequent narrator of documentaries. And he joked with me when he was writing Palimpsest that he was going to call the book An Actor Prepares instead. That would be his autobiography. Instead, he said, I'll call it Palimpsest. Oh my God, here, the book has come. And palimpsest, which he said was a word that no one knows, and that it was a life that no one would know after reading the book. Now, here I am winging it and telling these stories. There's one that I will tell rather than read, and that's that Gore, as those of you who saw him on television, especially in his debates with Mailer, or with, if you want to call them debates, with Buckley, know that he was a man of great self-possession, and he always had a bon mot close to hand. And what I noticed, though, was that when you were with him over a period of time, you could see that he practiced these lines. He began using some of these lines at dinner or over drinks, and then he would refine them, and you'd see them cropping on television or quoted in the New York Times or something like this. But he also was quite good at coming up with lines on the fly, as it were. And I remember when Godfather 3 was being filmed in Rome, a mutual friend of ours, yours and mine, named Mickey Knox, who later became the name of the character in Natural Born Killers, Mickey Knox. He was a flavorful guy who lived in Rome, a kind of minor Hollywood figure there, who Gore was very loyal to. But Gore showed up at a party that Mickey had. Mickey was famous for hosting parties where he cooked his famous beanless, meatless chili and would feed. He fed it to all the people on Godfather 3, and Al Pacino was there, and a couple of other people that you would recognize, but there were people that I didn't recognize. But I mostly stayed with Gore, and we were chatting. And at the end of the evening, a very handsome young guy came up and said, "Before I leave, I want to say goodbye to my favorite author." And Gore sort of held his hand out like the Pope's ring to be kissed. And this guy said, "No, I don't mean you. I mean Mr. Mewshaw." And I thought, this can't be. And I said, "What have you ever read of mine?" He said, "Well, I don't read much. As a matter of fact, I'm sort of dyslexic, but I read an article that you wrote about taking your children to the first McDonald's in Rome, and that's the best thing I've ever read." It turned out this guy it was Andy Garcia that said this. Okay, well, as he's walking away, he no sooner turns around than Gore says to me, "You can have all the dyslexic ones." I think that was pretty good for speaking on the fly there. He was, at his best, a very, very funny guy, very good company. There was another aspect of him that didn't come in for a lot of comment during his life. Maybe people didn't know it and he hid it, but he was profoundly depressed, really, for the last 25 years of his life. I mean, suicidally depressed. Linda reminded me that he was 57 when he first told us that he was thinking of suicide. And then I remember him telling me at one point that he had a glass of scotch in his hand and said, "This will do it soon enough." So it didn't do it soon enough. It sort of self-medicated. But I'd like to read you about a trip that I took down to Ravello. Surely you've all seen the pictures of his house in Ravello that's been in every magazine in the world. And I was going down there actually to interview him for Architectural Digest, and they did what must have been the third article they'd done on the novella. I might mention part of his generosity was to let me move there and live there while he was gone to finish a book, which again, I don't see Hemingway giving me his villa in Cuba, or Somerset Maugham saying come to Saint-Jacques-Cap-Ferrat. But at any rate, this is a little section about visiting Gore in the early 90s, when he would have been, I guess, in his mid to late 60s. I came there with a couple called Donald and Louisa Stewart. Donald Stewart was the son of Donald Ogden Stewart, who was a great literary guy in his day. Now, if I'd had this book earlier, you might ask why I don't have a book with me, and it's because our bags never made it to Madrid, so my bags with a copy of my book in it is still lost in space somewhere. So excuse me for, they've just arrived. Oh hell, I'll read you a different section, which is a good one. Not about Architectural Digest, but about a magazine that I've worked for many magazines. The common denominator of all of them is either I screwed up the assignment and it never was printed, or the magazine died before it ever was printed. In this case, in 1998, I had an assignment from an embryonic magazine, Notorious, named not after the 1946 film starring Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman, but in honor of the rap singer Biggie Smalls, a.k.a. Notorious B.I.G., who had been gunned down the previous year during a drive-by shooting in L.A. His pal, Sean Puff Daddy Combs, financed the enterprise and commissioned an interview with Gore Vidal for its inaugural issue. Somehow, Notorious contrived to die as dead as Biggie Smalls before its first issue hit the newsstand. But the trip to Ravello was memorable. Our younger son Mark came along with Linda and me. Then a senior at the American School in London, Mark had read 1876 and was eager to meet the author. I warned Mark that Gore might confuse him with his older brother Sean and call him the dwarf, which he often did. My son is 6'6", but he persisted in calling him the dwarf. I decided against mentioning that that Gore remembered Mark as a child in Rome wearing a kimono. Ever since then, he presumed that the boy had grown up to be a cross-dresser. Gore laid down the usual caveat that I write nothing about his having a receding hairline. That was the only caveat before he could read to the article. There was a new demand, however, and that was that I fax my questions in advance. He would respond in writing, after which the Q&A had to run unedited. As we drove south, rain dogged us every place except in the mountains where snow fell that April on forsythia blossoms. By the time we reached Ravello, a gale had wrung the dampness out of the sky, but the air was raw and wintry. Abiding strictly by the calendar, Italians had switched off all the heat back in March, and our room at the Hotel Colombo was as cold as a meat locker. Bundling up in overcoats, Linda and I hiked to La Rondinaya while Mark remained at the hotel. Wind rattled through the chestnut and cypress trees, shaking water from low-hanging limbs. Dead leaves and flower petals circulated in the swimming pool. From a distance, the villa looked deserted, desolate. In Gore's study, where embers glowed feebly in the fireplace, a fierce chill stole from the bare floors and walls into our bones. The windows were wide open in the vain hope of a warming breeze. The temperature inside was the same as it was outside. As always, the writing table in Gore's study spilled over with pens and pencils and yellow legal pads, manuscript pages, letters, and two portable Olivetti typewriters. A pale cat with hairless pink ears lay curled amid the chaos. Gore said the cat had caught cancer from his halogen lamp. He and Howard were sprawled at the either end of the sofa, highball glasses in hand. Normally they drank wine with lunch, but never hard liquor before sundown. They were both quite drunk and urged us to join them. "It'll warm your blood," Howard said. Howard is his longtime companion. "Nothing else in this fucking house will." "What news of Martin Amis?" Gore asked. Aware that I played tennis with Amis in London, he presumed, as did other people, that I knew England's preeminent novelist far better than I did. Whenever interviewers inquired, I limited myself to comments about Amis's impeccable line calls and relentless retrieving. Gore used to refer to him as Little Martin, but after Amis reviewed palimpsest enthusiastically, he dropped the diminutive. "Martin's brilliant," I replied, putting on my best British accent. "What news of America?" A far better mimic than I, Gore affected a cornpone accent. "There's a rumor Slick Willie Clinton's not going to beat this Monica Lewinsky scandal. They say his baby gravy's all over that gal's dress." You mean his boy butter? Howard tossed a chunk of olive wood into the fireplace. It fell like a brick, setting off an eruption of sparks, but no warmth at all. Howard sagged back on the sofa. Fucking house. Fucking cold. Maybe it would help to shut the windows, Linda suggested. Then the smoke will smother us. This may be our last winter here, Gore said. We're thinking of moving into town. Rome? Back into Rome? No, into Ravello. During the worst months, we'll check into a hotel here. Howard giggled at the notion of relocating a quarter of a mile to a village that in winter was as dead as church Latin. You'd never know, he said, that we had a perfectly nice, perfectly well-heated house in the Hollywood Hills. All my stuff is here, Gore protested. My books, the art. So ship it back to the States, Howard said. Gore glanced at the clock. I guess they were expecting guests and wanted Linda and me out of the way, but when I mentioned getting back to the Palumbo, they begged us to stick around. When did Barbara promise she'd call, Howard asked. Midday, New York time, Gore said, as soon as she gets word. Given the gravity of his voice, he might have been waiting for a medical diagnosis, but it emerged that he had been shortlisted for a literary prize. He wouldn't say which one, and he downplayed his chances of winning. Still, he stayed in the freezing study, and we stayed with him, waiting for Barbara Epstein to ring with what he guaranteed would be bad news. It was dark, and Howard had switched on the lights by the time the call came. Gore languidly answered the phone, languidly listened, languidly thanked her, then languidly placed the receiver on its cradle. He peered into the fireplace at one or two live coals in a heap of ashes. He waggled his forefinger in the Italian fashion, miming no. Fucking people, Howard said. They don't deserve you. Gore stood up, straightened his blazer, and stepped over to the writing table, each gesture a concerted effort to demonstrate that he couldn't care less about the lost prize. He picked up a copy of The Nation magazine and passed it to Linda. Here's an article of mine that might interest you, he said. Why don't you read it? Sure. Mark's at the hotel. He'll want to read it too, Linda said. He's a great fan of yours. I'd rather you read it now, he said. Out loud, if you don't mind. The whole thing? Linda asked. Yes. Then coldly polite, if you don't mind. With that, he settled in for the next half hour and listened to his own prose, rigid in his refusal to admit that he was upset. Afterward, he thanked Linda and said he and Howard would join us for dinner at the Sasso, a new luxury hotel. I insisted that Notorious pick up the bill. Then before leaving, I asked whether he had answered the questions which I had faxed him. Gore assured me he would attend to them tonight and have the interview in my hands by morning. Considering his current mood, this struck me as improbable. The Hotel Sasso, subsequently renamed Palazzo Avino, was accessible from Ravello's main square via a long oleander-lined staircase, the Viale Richard Wagner. Set between the Palumbo Hotel and the Caruso Hotel, the Sasso was an upscale, updated establishment sleekly inserted into a 12th century villa. With its uncluttered decor and immense windows, it had Ravello's standard, that is to say, astounding views of the sea. But its greatest luxury that raw spring night was its efficient heating system. Linda and Mark and I arrived early, only to discover that Gore had gotten there before us and was at the bar sipping a martini. He explained that Howard didn't feel well and had remained at home. The hotel manager, aware of hosting the town's most celebrated citizen, ushered us into the restaurant, Rossellini's. None of the local tomato sauce and mozzarella goop, Gore said. This place is shooting for the stars, Michelin stars. With the manager hovering, the maitre d' proposed that we let him serve us a selection of assaggini, sample tastings from the restaurant's specialties. And with our permission, he would choose a wine, a new bottle with each mini course. Gore signaled for him to bring it on, the assaggini and the wine and another martini as an aperitivo for him. Between one thing and another, between one bottle and the next, I have no clear recollection of the meal, except that there was too much of it and that I feared that the feast would cost far more than my fee from Notorious. Money, however, wasn't all I had on my mind. I I tried to keep track of how much wine Gore poured for Mark, who at the age of 17 was hard put to digest the alcohol on top of Gore's diatribe against Rai television in Italy. Apparently a producer had promised to shoot a profile of him, and after squandering days of his time, had delivered nothing except excuses. By midnight, 5 empty bottles were strewn like dead soldiers on a tablecloth stained with blood-red wine. When the manager suggested an after-dinner drink, Gore requested grappa and announced that he and Howard were considering the Hotel Sasso as their winter residence away from their villa. The manager said, "Well, then please accept tonight's meal as an omaggio, a small token of the warm welcome that awaits you and your friend." I was greatly relieved. By now, the restaurant was empty and waiters were stacking chairs. When I offered to walk him back to the Rondinaya, Gore protested, although it was unclear exactly what he protested. Was it the end of the evening? Would he rather make it to the villa alone? Or was he desperate not to return to those icy rooms in the scene of this afternoon's setback? He was as close to complete incoherence and physical collapse as I had ever seen him. With Mark's help, I hauled him to his feet and guided him out of the Sasso and into the cold air. That revived him a bit. "Let me go," he slurred. He lurched down Viale Richard Wagner, thudding to his knees, bounced up like a jack-in-the-box. Determined to make it on his own steam, he reeled from oleander bush to oleander bush, lamppost to lamppost, grabbing one, groping for the next. On level ground in the square, having nothing else to hang on to, he sagged against me, all 230 pounds of him. It felt as if I was pulling a plow over cobblestones, past the bar Al San Domenico and down the dark, bumpy path to one gate then another. He fumbled the keys from his blazer pocket, but I had to do the unlocking, which meant letting Gore's flop onto his butt. When we reached La Rondinaya, he kissed me smack on the mouth for the first and only time in 37 years, and as he disappeared into the villa, it dawned on me, as it had on previous occasions, that tonight was the night he'll die. Again, I was wrong. More than just wrong, ridiculously off base. In the morning, he delivered a clean typescript of the Q&A. Because Notorious, instead of Gore, died, the Independent published the answers in England, but it never has appeared in the States. And if you are patient enough and have enough stamina, I'll read you this review that never appeared in the United States or in France, which was set during the era of Miss Lewinsky and that sort of thing. So I said, MM says, during Watergate, you said you couldn't wait to get out of bed each morning to get your daily fill of the scandal's latest developments. Do you feel the same about Clinton and Zippergate? GV. There is a certain dull monotony to the attacks on Clinton. For one thing, he himself is well-liked and no one save the mad. All right, half of American people should probably be in a bin somewhere. No one finds him at all like Nixon, who at every full moon became a werewolf to the applause, no doubt of the binnable half. Kenneth Starr, of course, is seriously unhinged in the Elmer Gantry snake oil selling, Jesus quoting Southern way. And I suppose when he finally cracks up on television and bites deep into Tom Brokaw's Pretty Juggler, my jaded attention will finally be caught. Now, this is what he wrote that night after all that. I find it flabbergasting. You don't seem to view Clinton's alleged peccadillos with the same seriousness as Nixon's. GV. Watergate was this subversion of the Constitution by an incumbent president. Clinton's sole crime was a disinclination to confess to a grand jury that he likes the odd blowjob, a taste he shares with most of the male population. In respectable societies, gentlemen and ladies never discuss their sex lives in public, and if confronted with the subject, they are expected, nay suborned, to lie. In a survey in a recent book, The Day America Told the Truth, over 90% of U.S. citizens confess to being habitual liars. Bad lawyers have made a fetish of perjury, something no other country bothers much about, unless something real crime, like murder, is being investigated. Clinton should have refused to respond to Starr's literally impertinent questions about his private life. To what extent is the sex life of the president a legitimate political concern? If he was a sex criminal, a rapist, a blackmailer, of course it would be relevant. But what consenting adults do, blah, blah, blah. In your memoir, Palimpsest, you pointed out that the variety and intensity of John Kennedy's sex life bore some resemblance to your own. You both seem to be subscribed to the theory that one should never turn down an opportunity to be on TV or to have sex. Do you believe that part of Clinton's alleged promiscuity is simply a matter of a famous man having more opportunities? Obviously, he said. Also, the drive that gets one to the peculiar state of, quote, famous, end quote, in a very peculiar country like the United States, superstitious, bigoted, and worst of all, garrulous, is apt to be accompanied by a strong sex drive. The press acts as if Clinton uses high office to get girls. It's the other way around. It is the high profile that is like catnip to women. Watch them crowd around Leonardo DiCaprio. Those prepubescent girls are going to eat him raw one day. The Bacchae was a realistic play. Mewshaw, if famous men do have more opportunities, was Marx, I'm speaking of Karl now, not Groucho, correct to say a change in quantity is a change in quality? That's one way of looking at it, Gore said, though most of us prefer quantity to start with. Boys are meant to squirt as often as possible with as many different partners as possible. Girls are designed to take 9 months to lay an egg. Different wavelengths. Groucho Marx at the end of his life was asked if he had to do all over again, what would he do differently? His answer was, try another position. According to news, I go on with my questions. According to news reports, which may amount to no more than slightly refined gossip, President Clinton's encounters with Monica Lewinsky consisted of oral sex. The invariable assumption is that he was the receiver. Is it possible that as a national leader, he was more concerned about the young woman's pleasure and was the giver? GV. Richard Morris will have to rule on who is giving the pleasure and who is the taker. I suspect that Clinton doesn't much care for warm, mature relationships with warm, caring women. In his recent book about John F. Kennedy, Seymour Hersh suggests that the president's complicated sex life left him open to blackmail, brought him into contact with low-life hookers and mobsters, and definitely affected his conduct in office. Do you agree? Couldn't you see that happening in Clinton's case? Yes, but the Giancana connection was forged long before they shared Miss Exner, Gore said. To what extent might Clinton be accused of similar offenses? Clinton, as far as we know, isn't into crime. The Kennedys, thanks first to Honey Fitz, mayor of Boston, and then to his son-in-law Joe Kennedy, were deeply involved with the mafia. That was the heart of Hersh's book. But Marilyn Monroe got the headlines, as the media cannot bear anything actually true, because sooner or later they are going to be fingered too. You've often questioned the cult that surrounded the Kennedys. Why do you think the public continues to care? And does the public's obsession with the Kennedy explain your own ongoing willingness to write about them? Hey, look, I wrote about them briefly in Palimpsest. After all, Jackie and I were brought up in the same house by the same people. In 38 years, I've written exactly 3 pieces about the Kennedys, hardly obsessive. In your autobiography, you claim that your relationship with Howard has endured for decades because it's non-sexual. Could you address this? Do you view sex as antithetical to an ongoing relationship, or the reverse? I've made it a rule, he said, never to have sex with friends. One can always find sex, as Bill Clinton will tell you, but one doesn't often find friends that easily, as Bill will also tell you. You've expressed dissatisfaction with journalists and their tendency to turn interviews into diatribes against you. Is it possible that President Clinton is partly a victim of the same kind of misrepresentation? GV. When Hillary Clinton came to call on me a couple of summers ago, this is the sort of thing he was forever tossing. When Margaret, Princess Margaret, or Margaret Fuller, or Queen Margaret of Sweden, whenever they were there, we did nothing but trade stories on what people had invented about us. It's not the diatribes one minds, it's the quotation of something you never said. This need not be the result of malice. Incompetence is also a journalistic failing. What do you see as Clinton's lasting legacy? If nothing else, has he changed the nature of the presidential discourse? The post-Truman presidents are all fading away, as our American empire is doing, though too slowly for my taste. Since we have elections but no politics, Clinton has been the opening wedge for a truly great diversion, the candidate's sex life. This really keeps us away from discussing politics, a discussion that the owners of the country fear most. What is politics? Who collects what money from whom to spend on whom for what? That's all there is to it, but no politician in the United States dares address that subject for fear we'll discover who bought him and for how much, not to mention how the budget of the military got to be $5 trillion. Anyway, that's the end of the interview, and that'll be the end of my dramatic reading. But I'm sure that that some of you must have questions, and I could entertain them if you wanted to. Again, one is tempted to say, was it because he was drunk, or was a heavy drinker and that depressed him, or was he drinking because he was depressed? I mean, I think he was chemically depressed, or, I mean, I don't want to psychoanalyze him, something that he loathed. He regarded psychoanalysis kind of voodoo. But he came from he had a dreadful childhood. He was the product of a drunken and promiscuous mother whose mind was never on him but always on the next rich man that she could marry. And she herself got off a great wisecrack, though. She said that when she married Gore's father, it turned out that he had 3 testicles, and the next man she married had 2 testicles. The next one had 1, and she said, "I'm not going to get married anymore because even I can add." But she was somebody who was out there constantly looking for husbands or looking for an affair and had no interest in him. And as he told me many times, was stashing him in various schools, each farther away from home. His father was sort of indifferent to him. His father was an interesting guy who went to the military academy and was an All-American football player. I wonder how many of you knew that, and was in the 1920 Olympics in the pentathlon. And Gore was actually born at West Point, which is something to conjure by. But I think he had a pretty dreadful upbringing and was extraordinarily isolated. People that I knew who knew him at Exeter when he went there said that he was extraordinarily remote even then, but they all picked him to be the one who would become president, which was another, he had these political ambitions, but I think they were, incredibly unrealistic to think that he could ever win elective office. I thought it was, but I've tried to look it up. I thought it was that he had a volume of nonfiction coming out, and that it was the Pulitzer Prize that he felt he was up for, that he might qualify for. But he actually was voted. The Pulitzer voted for him to get the prize for Lincoln for fiction, and then the committee above the selection committee overruled it. The committee at Columbia or whatever it is said they weren't going to give it to Gore Vidal. So Gore was always saying that anybody who's not paranoid is not in full possession of the facts, and he had just enough facts to indicate that he was he was paranoid with good reason. That's a very good question. First of all, I think Atlas would have shrugged. I knew him for 37 years, during which time I published, let's say, 10 books. To my knowledge, Gore never read a word that I wrote. At most, he would say, "Howard read your last novel and loved it," or "He tells me that your article about Calvino was right on the mark." To my knowledge, Gore never read it, and it wasn't that wasn't part of our relationship. The question that you ask about what would he think about revelations, or that at a drunken evening he told Linda that he was suicidal. I mean, it was something that I think. He didn't just confide to Linda, or he just didn't confide to me. for decades, it was impossible to go to dinner with him, or I say impossible. It was frequent to go to dinner with him, and for him to say that he wanted to die, that he had nothing to live for. Now, of course, I mentioned at the beginning that he was an actor, he was a performer. Was this a role that he performed for his amusement or to win sympathy? I can't say, but I do know that he was very depressed, and I do know that it was a problem between him and Howard. And the question that you ask has implications, and that is, what responsibility does someone have who knew someone as a friend toward that person's life and toward their psychological life, their sexual life or something. I felt, first of all, Gore himself was very outspoken about everything. And although he said it's nobody's business what people do in bed, he had a relentless interest in what people did in bed. And he was a remarkably vivid reporter of the sexual equipment of all the celebrities that you ever wanted to know. I would think maybe he would say, well, you got me there, Mike, or that's the guy I was. I actually, when I say sympathy for the devil, I think most people thought of him as a devil, but I've tried to present him in this book as a man, flawed like any other man, and I think ultimately a really sad man. And toward the end of his life, look, we all get old and we all deteriorate. I mean, I don't plan to do so myself, but people say most people do. But this isn't really about this. This is a guy who I think the deterioration was much more serious and much quicker than it could or should have been, because he had no kind of support system around him. And after Howard died, that was it. I mean, Howard was the only one who could speak truth to him and try and keep him off the booze or something like that. You said you corresponded with him. Did you know him personally? Did you visit him?
No, but I remember having written to him. I particularly loved his novel Empire, and I wrote him a letter relative to that. And I remember he wrote back and he said, it would take too long to give the context, but the opening line of one of the letters he wrote to me was, I fear Henry Adams is not a name to drop in the age of Perot.
The Perot, the candidate. Right. No, he was a good correspondent, very clever in letters. I was very fond of him. I repeat, but his biographer, his authorized biographer, who's doing the second biography of him, Jay Perini, interviewed me, and because he didn't know much about Gore in Rome, but he also asked me, how are you going to deal with this? How are you going to deal with that? And I said, well, I would ask you the same question. How are you going to deal with the fact that Gore was the kind of person who said wildly inappropriate things, who said things about racial matters that would be considered just hair-raising now and would get you thrown off? Or how about his whole contentiousness with Israel and the Jews, where he had a point about Israel, he had a point about the Palestinians and so forth, but he frequently couched it in ways that only somebody who was a real masochist would do, because you're going to get clobbered when you refer to the Jews as the desert gods, or when you say whom the gods would destroy, they first put hair on their backs. I mean, this is something you're really asking for. But that was Gore's way. Gore was the kind of person who had a transgressive side, a very combative side. He was a very brave person, I also want to stress, and he would say things that, it seems to me, one doesn't hear said anymore about political figures or about issues. But he did have this aggressive side, and he would say things at dinner parties if he felt somebody was having a go at him, or somebody was not paying him, strictly speaking, enough attention or enough respect, and he would sing it to him. I remember a couple in Rome that we knew very well who worked for Mobil Oil, and they were business people, but they had this artistic side to them, and they went to the opera, and they supported museums, and they were dying to meet Gore, and I was dying for them not to meet Gore. But finally we had a dinner party, and we invited these people over, and they swarmed over him during drinks, asking him endless questions, and I could tell he was very polite, but I could tell this really wasn't the way he wanted to spend an hour before dinner. But then as we came to the table, before we sat down, he said, "Do you mind if I ask a question now?" He said, to the ladies at the table, he said, tell me, what do American women think of anal sex? And Linda was ladling up the pasta in brodo at that point, and she said, "Gore, American women don't talk about anal intercourse." And he said, "Oh, they may not talk about it, but they're doing it." And she said, "They may be doing it, but they don't talk about it before first course." Anyway, you need not buy the book now. You've heard the whole damn thing. Thank you very much.